teranga sunu ko mbalax ma ne welcome welcome to Sénégal pays de la fraternité du marché Sandaga yi supu ganja welcome to Sénégal Canadien américain marocain africain welcome to Sénégal black man white man yellow man rasta man welcome to Sénégal
Yeah. Sarah, you're muted.
Sorry. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first in this series of Future Focus webinars on the topic of the major challenges for global health in a post-COVID-19 world. So we're at an extraordinary moment, and this is looking to the challenges for the future, and with in mind the very important 125th anniversary of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. In this webinar, we have a great panel. We have we have Professor David Lalou, the director of the Liverpool School. We've got Sir Jeremy Farrar, who's director of the Wellcome Trust, Tamar Ghosh, who's the chief executive of the Royal Society of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we have Professor Tom Kariuki, Director of Programs at the African Academy of Sciences. I'm Sarah Bosley, Health Editor of The Guardian. So to kick us off, we've got David. Please do tell us a little bit about the very important anniversary coming up.
So I'd just like to add my welcome to that of Sarah's, and also to thank Sarah very much for taking this on. In 2023, LASTM will be 125. And over the next couple of years, we both want to look a little bit at what we've achieved in the previous century or so. But I think more importantly, look forward to global health challenges of the future, where organizations like funding agencies like LSTM will be, and what they can contribute as we move into a new era of global health. And so I hope you enjoy today, and this will be the first of many seminars and webinars over the next couple of years to address the real challenges of global health. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks very much indeed. So we're going to have a group discussion now on insights into the future of global health in this post-COVID-19 world that we're anticipating when it happens. If you'd like to join in the discussion, you can join in on Twitter with the hashtag LSTMFutureFocus. And the Q&A chat will be active throughout the webinar, so do send us any questions that you might have. So I thought I'd kick off, if it's possible, with you, Jeremy. Maybe you'd like to tell us what you think the post-COVID world is going to look like to you, and what effect the pandemic has had on global health generally and those people who work in it.
Well, I hope Sarah, thanks very much, and David and everybody at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and early congratulations on 125 years, and hope to be part of some of the celebrations in that year, in person, not virtually. Sarah, thanks very much for doing this as well, and it's great to join Tamar and Tom as well. Sarah, whatever happens, I hope it doesn't look like it does today. Just up with this pandemic, I'm fed up of this sitting room, and whilst Teams and Zoom have been fantastic, it doesn't beat the real thing. So I hope we can look forward with a bit more optimism at some point. I think the events of 2020, and let's not kid ourselves. We're a long way from being through this yet. Whether we're at the beginning, middle, or towards the end, I've got no idea. My guess is actually towards the beginning, and this isn't just suddenly going to disappear. So we've a long way to go, and there's parts of the world. Tom might want to speak to this. I think the continent of Africa remains very, very vulnerable. I think for those at the Liverpool School who've known this, obviously, and people in global health, I think the major things for me coming through this are, it's a reminder, if anybody needed it, that the world is very vulnerable. Whether it be to pandemics like this, or climate change, or energy or water access, the world is very vulnerable, and there's no opportunity for the world to go back to a nationalistic past and think you can solve the problems, because the problems are all transnational, and therefore the solutions will be as well. It's exposed inequalities, inequalities that everybody at the Liverpool School know were there, but it's exposed those in every society and between societies. I think it shows that resilience has to be put more paramount than efficiency. The center of gravity has got to shift. We've got to have resilience everywhere, not determined by sensors in particular parts of the world or in particular countries. And finally, on innovation, we've shown that we can innovate at speed. And we can make vaccines quickly. Vaccinology has been in a bit of the doldrums because the challenges of, for instance, TB, HIV, and malaria. But the truth is, we can still make vaccines. And I think the technological advances in 2020 have been dramatic. And we now need to make sure that vaccines are okay, but vaccination is what's important. And that has to be done equitably, and it has to be done fairly, and it has to be done globally. And for me, those are the 4 or 5 big lessons.
So do you think actually that, are you optimistic in fact about the future? Do you think that the pandemic's effect will be actually to advance global health, in that it's been such a focus and priority for everybody, for the entire world?
You have to be optimistic because there is no other way, frankly. And if this crisis, and we shouldn't underestimate this crisis. I mean, in terms of public health impact, and not just on health, but on the broader health agenda, cardiovascular disease, oncology, maternal child health, vaccinations, mental health, on the economies of the world, on education, on opportunity, on inequality, on geopolitics. This has affected every single bit of societies. And if this doesn't wake us up, as the last 25 years didn't with SARS-1 and MERS and Ebola and Zika and all of the others, if this doesn't wake us up to the 21st century and our interconnectivity, our vulnerabilities, and our need to come together and provide solutions in an equitable way with the central gravities where they need to be, nothing's going to. So you have to be optimistic that finally the penny will drop. It will.
Yeah. Yes, I sincerely hope you're right. Tom, actually, since Jeremy did refer to you just there, shall we move to you? And love to know what you think needs to be done to strengthen research capacity in the global south, and whether in fact the pandemic has had a positive effect for you too.
Thanks. And I think we can address this by just starting by saying that I think, like Jeremy has said, it's not even clear to us in Africa whether we are actually, have we escaped? Probably not. Or are we still very pessimistic about what the future might bring? And I think that's a major concern for all of us, because I think in Africa, so far, it seems to me that there are some lessons and there are challenges that are very obvious to us. I think deploying COVID vaccines to as many people can get it is very, very important, so that we get a little bit of equitable allocations and access to these vaccines as they come online would become very, very important for Africa. And I think we are still trying to figure out what will happen over the next month and weeks, ahead of us. There are many drivers with regard to where we are and what might happen in future. Whether we are looking at any emerging and re-emerging pathogens in Africa, we are not quite sure whether it is, will be driven for this one and for the future, whether it will be driven by climate change or biodiversity and habitat degradation, or whether it is the illegal international and local animal trade that happens in many parts of the continent. So there are concerns for us about this pandemic and the next one, whether it is disease X, Y, Z, or whatever that might emerge in future. So for us, I think it's very important to focus on the improvement on vaccines and as needed based on the data after immunization. But I think our major concern is to see how much we can get out of this. But I think the most important concerns for all of us right now is the emerging new variants that is currently coming out of Africa, specifically from South Africa. And I think it's important to understand what is the current thinking on vaccine efficacy against new variants. Will Africa get vaccines before new variants overrun the continent, as chipping up in South Africa? And I think it is very important to then look at how we're building these scientific and technological challenges to make it all of us globally connected as an enterprise that can look at all the areas around basic preclinical, clinical testing capacities and diagnostics and that are required for these vaccines. So, yeah, there are optimism that once the vaccines are available, then hopefully we can get those going very, very quickly before the highly transmissible variants get hold of the continent. If they are not already arriving in many corners, or there could be other very areas where there could actually be a hindrance, including social attitudes, vaccine hesitancy or denial, the mistrust around science, and too many conspiracy theories, including in Africa, around what all this means for us. So yes, for us, I think it's making sure that we remain connected connected to various communities to enhance and to expand all these global collaborations that can help us to support the next journey to address COVID-19.
So yes, indeed. David, then, can I move to you and just ask you how you think things are going to pan out for global health, in this context, and also in Africa in particular. There is a terrible sense, I have a terrible sense actually, that most of the world is worrying about itself and ignoring Africa. It's coming very much bottom of the pile when it comes to attention. What do you think?
So I'm delighted that Jeremy is optimistic, and those of you that know me will recognise I'm normally optimistic, but I think there are some concerns that we need to reflect here. I think it's interesting, in the UK, for the first time, maybe for some time, we've recognised how the economy and health are interconnected, and a health crisis has led to a real decline in economic strength. That has long been evident in many lower middle income countries. We saw the effect of HIV on the economy. We've seen the interrelatedness of economic development and health improvement. And I must admit, I'm concerned for the decline in economic strength of many countries actually making an impact on global health. We've seen already, for example, the UK reduction in overseas development funding as a consequence of the economic problems in the UK. And we're likely to see reduced spending on health in many countries where LSTM works. And so I think there was real concerns about financing of health. I guess the other issue for me particularly is that we've made huge advances in malaria control, NTD control, and maternal improvement in maternal health over the last 20 years. And we have to make sure that all of those improvements are protected. We know, for example, that because of fears around COVID, people do not go to hospital when they have obstetric complications, for example. We know that malaria control programs have been hit by the inability to go out into the field, and that malaria control in some countries is starting to decline. And so I think there needs to be a lot of work on how we maintain those improvements. Inequity is something that Jerry mentioned. Inequity of access to care occurs both between countries and within countries. And economic decline only just tends to exaggerate that inequity. And at a point when we've made, I think, considerable progress in many countries towards the Sustainable Development Goals and universal health care, I do think there is a real chance that some of those improvements will start to halt and to stutter. And so I think for me that one of the most important things is ensuring that we don't move backwards, that we do get adequate funding into the system, and that we make sure that all those advances are not just lost in the next couple of years for the reasons I've outlined.
So Tamar, that's a very good moment to come to you, I think. What do you think the policymakers are doing here? Are they doing what they ought to be doing? Politicians, businessmen, philanthropists, what sort of effort are they making to improve global health in the long term?
Well, first of all, thank you to Liverpool School for inviting me to join, and lovely to join you all for this conversation. As Jeremy said, who knows where we are exactly in this pipeline? If we're beginning still, in the middle, or the end. And I guess a lot of the successes that we'll look to for policy change, for funding and for research will come towards the end and afterwards as we look back and capture the learnings. I think one of the things that David and Jeremy mentioned, and Tom actually, was around this, the need to be able to not lose the ground that we've already, achieved in the last decades. And as a society like ours, our members are working in different aspects of global health and tropical medicine. The most important thing is to make sure that we're providing the platforms and the funding to help capture those learnings, and to make sure that we don't lose that opportunity. And that could be around getting lots of research published, understanding, you know, things that we've observed. It could be around getting more of the small grants out to particularly those early in their careers. I think one, if we can see a positive from the society's perspective, the knowledge of global health now has improved enormously. And the hope is that we have people from many disciplines that we know are needed to improve human health. Not just the obvious ones that we know and work with most closely, hospitals, university and others, but disciplines on the social science side. The hope is that they then attract more people into this space and that those minds help push forward on the innovation. So, you know, I've certainly seen anecdotally lots of discussions from philanthropists and foundations looking at ways they can really help support the here and now and the response, but also the preparedness. But I guess, you know, the success of that is going to take us a long time to be able to judge. And I hope that as a society that we're working with our members, we can provide the platforms that provide experience and expertise and knowledge and data, and hopefully inspiration to those younger generations to start working in this field. You know, we've seen so much more education of what infectious disease is. You know, that there's more conversations and actions around, for example, hygiene methodology and PPE. I mean, all of these things hopefully will attract more people, more knowledge into the sector, and that's a great thing for us if we can convene those groups in new ways, and if we can make sure that we harness the learnings and inspire them to be the next generation of leaders. I think that would be a great response to the crisis.
I have to say that from where I'm sitting in a newspaper office, or most of the time in this little room, actually, everything else seems to be off the agenda apart from COVID. You know, all the things that I used to write about are no longer of any interest to anyone out there. And I'm really talking about readership, obviously, politicians perhaps as well. You know, how do we get the conversation onto other things beyond COVID itself, do you suppose? Sort of welcome to anybody there who would like to discuss. Jeremy, perhaps? How do you move it back from COVID onto other aspects of global health, do you think?
I'm not really sure. I think at the moment we are facing such a existential crisis, frankly, of the way health and COVID and the economies, as David was rightly saying, and their secondary impacts, that we do need to, I agree, move the conversation on, but we have to solve COVID. You know, we can't, you know, David's right about, you know, maternal child care, vaccination schedules, mental health, cardiovascular, all of the other health issues are absolutely poor, as well as education. Schools are out in almost every country to some degree or other, but we're not going to be able to get those back until we can relieve this pressure from COVID. And with the new variants coming, as Tom was saying, we are in something of a race at the moment to both reduce transmission through non-pharmacological interventions and get the vaccines out before they become useless and drive down transmission. And at the moment, because of the drive of the last 6 weeks, the mood and the tension has changed completely in the last 6 weeks. And we have to get it back to a more equitable distribution of the vaccines. Countries have gone from thinking that they were going to be vaccinating 30% of their populations to vaccinating 100% of their populations and keeping a stockpile in case immunity wanes in the winter of 2021. So the global supply is at a crisis point. And I think we cannot get back to delivering really any standard of other activities of health or education or others until we actually get over this awful period of COVID.
Yeah, now we're having a fight in the EU as well over supply, aren't we? So David, I mean, you haven't got vaccines yet, have you, in Africa, pretty much? What's how is it looking as far as you're concerned with dealing with the situation as it stands at the moment? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean David, I meant Tom. I'm sorry.
Right. So I think for Africa there are some lessons and there are some challenges, and I think there is some things we can take forward even as we continue to grapple with the various challenges. And there are many. Yes, COVID is a major concern for all of us. But we have to remember that the infectious disease burden globally, 25% of that burden is in Africa. So with Africa, there is a need for us to continue to build and to contribute to the discovery, development, and the delivery of the next generation of these disease interventions. We want in Africa to see more African governments, the private sector, the philanthropy, just to have conversations about how we can build better the R&D infrastructure in Africa. And the contribution for the organization that I lead, the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa, which is the platform hosted at the African Academy of Sciences. I think a critical thing that we are learning with COVID is so much more is needed to be invested in clinical and critical research innovations with outcomes that are really focused on the health populations, but also looking at all the other things that are interwoven with that, including climate adaptation, the need for governance that is strengthened, and how we then connect with all these communities and collaboration. One of the things that we've been trying to do is to see how we can strengthen clinical trial networks in Africa through engaging with governments. There are the national and regional partners. There are product development partnerships. There are biopharma that we have been talking to bring a little bit more of their work in Africa, despite most of the discovery and basic science is being done by them in the north. We still want them to come and do a little bit more than in Africa. We've been discussing with CEPI, for example, whether they are considering calls for clinical trials in low and middle income countries to ensure that all vulnerable populations are protected. These are conversations that are important. And I think it's to say that at the level of the Pan-African, at the level of regional and country level organizations, one of the big things for them to have a good discussion with all of us is their preparedness for outbreak preparedness for the future. And I think we have some good organizations like Africa CDC and the World Health Organization, AFRO, to engage on the regional socio-economic bodies, including how this can advocate for financing products that can support outbreak preparedness across the continent. And then for us at IESA, I think one of the things is to say that we want to see more of our investment that we get from Wellcome or we get from other funders globally, to see whether a lot of that money can go to research consortia like Deltas, for example, that focus on pandemic biology, epidemiology. They are doing preclinical and clinical R&D work, community engagement, and building capacity. Can we actually get a little bit more of those networks that are building critical mass of people, and they are strengthening infrastructure? And so I think I am optimistic looking at some of what has been achieved, for example, with some of the virology and structural biology work that has been done by some of our grantees in the period of the COVID, where we are looking at some novel lineage that are coming out of some of the laboratories that we are supporting, which contains, they are showing the multiple mutations that are coming out of those laboratories around spike protein. And I think, on one hand, I celebrate the support through IESA and funders that we are slowly but surely building capacities in Africa, but it is not good news on all these variants that we are now seeing reports from Nigeria, from Kenya, from South Africa, and from elsewhere. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So David, to go back to you, how do you feel that you can help with in Africa in particular? I know that that what you're trying to do is to forge partnerships, aren't you?
Yes, and I think, as we've touched on already, what is critical here, and I think COVID has reinforced this, is the importance of everyone working in partnerships. Generally, it's the only way we're going to solve this problem for countries, for Europe, and actually across the world. So partnership, I think, are absolutely key. It's certainly something that's been at the heart of what LSTM tries to do. Generally, it's the only way to make significant progress. And I think, for me, it comes back a great deal to this issue of resilience. Pushing the resilience and developing resilience in health systems has been, I think, a topic we've talked about for some time. This crisis just illustrates even more starkly how resilience in the system is absolutely key to be able to deal with these kind of emergencies. And that's resilience to cope with which is a large number of COVID patients, but it's resilience to actually maintain access to poor people for healthcare in a system that may not be funded very strongly. So I think one of our roles here in LSTM is to continue to actually develop that resilience agenda and think through how that can best be done in partnership with groups. I think we've also, again, touched on the importance of public health. And I think, if anything, COVID has reminded us how important public health is. And I mean classical public health, understanding surveillance, understanding organisms, understanding what's going on. Tom's talked about some of the opportunities I think that have come out of COVID in that regard. But we need much better surveillance systems generally around the world, because the world is interconnected, and this has shown it even more starkly than ever. We've talked about surveillance systems, for example, in Africa for some time around antimicrobial resistance. But absolutely, we need to get better surveillance around the world for the next emerging disease and for many other reasons. And I think that basic public health is something that we will be certainly doing and looking how we can do a lot more in the future as well.
Out of interest, do you anticipate a flood of applications to the Liverpool School on the back of the COVID pandemic?
Well, I think it's interesting. We have, I think in general, we've seen a greater interest in global health over the last 5 years. People have become more aware of global health as an issue. And I think this will bring it home. And so I do hope that certainly there will be a much greater interest in this interconnectedness and how we can't work in isolation. I mean, the trouble, I think, is that what we are starting to see is countries reduced into isolation at the moment, paradoxically, and you illustrated that with a European kind of initiative to keep all their vaccine supplies. But I do think generally people recognise the world is smaller than ever, and global health becomes more important, therefore.
Tamar, can I ask, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yes, and I agree with David. We've seen great interest. So in the middle of the year last year, we saw an enormous upsurge in publishing in our journals. So that may be because people were at home and able to write up the studies that they maybe hadn't had time to before. But also an enormous increase in applications for our small grants. We fund very early career researchers, often for their first piece of research in an aspect of tropical medicine and global health. And we saw an increase of over 50% in applications. And what's great in those is that we did see lots of applications coming in focused on COVID as it was starting to emerge. We also saw lots of other disease areas being represented, non-communicable diseases included, so looking at mental health and other studies. And I think one of the roles we have to play as a society is to make sure that we keep that breadth as much as we can. And you asked before about how we make sure that other things don't get forgotten. I think for us, when we're a society of lots of people doing very different things, it's making sure that our funding, the way we're talking about profiling disease areas, research gaps, policy changes, needs to try and be as broad as possible. We need to make sure that we're not dropping some of those learnings, some of that experience, some of that knowledge too much, and that's hard with limited capacity. That is difficult, but I do think that's one of our challenges, and in why it's been such a busy year. And I hope that this year we see again an increased interest, and that could come through from attendance at events like this. Seeing people that maybe wouldn't have been interested before starting to get an interest, different disciplines coming in, as I mentioned, and hopefully we can fund more early career researchers, people taking their first steps into this area of work and looking at new innovations that would help us in the future.
Okay, we have got quite a few questions. Perhaps we'll try some of those from people who've put them to us, as long as I can read them. Now let's just see. So there's some of these sort of do tend to address some of the things we've looked at, but there's sorry, they're flicking around now. There's right. So Professor Simeon Minning is asking, how will training in global health contribute to the One Health concept in our universities? I'm afraid that's a bit beyond me, but maybe that's one for David.
Yes, I think that's getting at that increasingly with emerging infections and some well-established infections, the interaction between human health and animal health is absolutely critical. And I think we've increasingly recognized that, and we've seen, I think, in many countries, that concept being accepted, and we've made huge advances in understanding human disease as a consequence. So I would agree that that's at the heart of global health training for many infectious diseases and emerging diseases.
There's a question here from David Molyneux, which we'd like to ask you. As far as vaccine delivery in Africa is concerned, is there adequate existing human capacity to achieve the required coverage? He says, I suspect that failure to deliver malaria and measles interventions will have a serious impact on child mortality, which will outstrip COVID deaths. That's, well, obviously I'd ask Tom that, and also Jeremy, but Tom?
I think we've been trying to build the critical masses that are required, and I guess this is going to be a journey. I mean, getting from having less than 200 scientists per million inhabitants to some sort of global average of 1,000 or more scientists per million inhabitants. It's going to take quite a bit of building and better, processes and resources being available. And so, but I think one of the lessons we have learned is that given the the pandemics and the outbreaks around Ebola that emerged out of many parts of the continent, West Africa was of course very devastating. There are, in a way, you could say there's an army of people who have been in the trenches, so to speak, and they have actually been ready to move forward and repurpose their work and the way in which they can deal with the outbreaks happening within their own localities. And I think that has been very, very useful. There are some infrastructure that actually have been built over the many years. There are better collaborations moving forward. There are good appreciation by governments actually and across boundaries and regions that actually they can do better if they work together when there are those outbreaks. But there's a lot to be done. I think we are looking forward to more investments becoming available from local and from businesses in Africa and those who can contribute to building that. So yes, numbers, infrastructure, there are constraints on skill, etc. that still needs to be built very quickly.
So I was going to suggest that Jeremy might have a view on this, but in fact, anybody who does would be very welcome. But Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's very good. Obviously, a question from David, as always. I think it's really important going forward that we don't all get dominated by emerging infections. I don't believe, although I come from a background in that myself, I don't believe you base a whole system around emerging infections. Because public health that David talked about earlier, David Lalou talked about earlier, and Tom's talked about, has to have utility all of the time for everything happening on a day-to-day basis, whether it's infectious diseases, non-communicable disease, or whatever, and then have the resilience and the surge capacity to identify when something odd happens and the capacity to respond to it. I would just counsel people not to set up lots of complex structures that only focus on emerging infections. Let's make public health of benefit all the time, and then let's make sure it has the surge capacity and the wit to know when something odd is happening and respond to it very quickly. I also have a concern, and this is no different in Liverpool for David or in Nairobi for Tom. Healthcare workers have been through an absolute nightmare in 2020 the world over. They are stretched beyond limits. They're tired. They're fed up. They haven't always been well looked after. They've got a priority for vaccination access. And we do run a risk when we come through COVID and out the other side that we will lose from those professions many healthcare workers, either because they got sick and tragically died, or because they've just had enough of that situation. And we do have to protect healthcare workers, both physically, but also mentally, and make sure that we don't have a massive loss to the professions across the world, whichever country you're in, because healthcare workers are absolutely critical to delivering the new global health that everybody wants.
Great. Either of you, Tamar or David, would you like to address this? Or
I had a small point to make, which was just around commonalities, really, and it links to another question there, which to do with funding. One of the things we have seen, and we've seen it from a data modeling perspective and a few other perspectives, is, you know, the recognition of the commonalities that exist between some of the strategic work needed to tackle COVID-19, whether that be around surveillance systems, whether that be around hygiene practice, whether that be around improving infrastructure or supply chains, which would be beneficial in many other existing disease areas. And I think one of the pieces of work that has been ongoing and that for us as a society we need to look at is, how do we make sure we capture all of those commonalities to make sure that, you know, when we're looking at funding projects, the outcomes of those are framed in such a way that they could also then be transferable and useful learnings for other areas, for COVID and other areas. So I think that's a big area to talk about, but I think there's something around the commonalities which may be helpful to some extent in terms of program delivery and funding.
Thank you. So we have a question here from, now I'm not going to be able to pronounce this and I apologize. It's Kashitij Manchanda, who asks, do you believe that this pandemic was the best thing that could have happened for the progression of global medicine as a whole? Brackets, provided that the mortality of the coronavirus is low and remains low. Does anybody want to put up a hand for that one?
Well,
maybe David. Yes.
Only just to reinforce what we've said, the only good thing about this that it has just emphasized how everything is connected. Ebola did that a little bit in West Africa, that suddenly in the West we saw that improving health and quality of health in Africa was relevant to the UK and Europe. And I think this again shows that there is importance in making sure that everywhere has good surveillance systems, and I take Jeremy's point completely around the general surveillance systems and public health, that everywhere around the world it is, I think, our role, our duty, and actually in our interest as a rich country to help those that are less well resourced to have good healthcare systems, because it protects the world's health. And I think that's probably one of the few good things that's come out of this. Unfortunately, we know that it's not a low mortality, and we've seen that tragically all over the world. And so I think many other things are deeply worrying. But there have been some good things.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just one lesson I think that, of course, one of the things that is coming out, of course, is we are all devastated in terms of the economies, and there is need for us to really consider whether there is a strong economic case for vaccine equity, and how we can find, and I think Jeremy and others, you have written about, for example, vaccine nationalism, and how that could cost the global economy trillions of dollars unless that is, if only that is confined only to the wealthiest people, that will become a big problem for the people who are in Africa and in low and middle income countries. So I think with regard to the economies of Africa, the rebound that is expected in 2021 is still very much a very big question mark. There are many impacted areas from jobs, travel, tourism, agriculture, the small and medium enterprises, international trade, supply chains, all of that. But one lesson I think is that the economic recovery, for example, for Africa could actually try to move away from the so-called extraction, mining, and all that sort of commodities to sort of a knowledge economy, and that could come with all sort of more investment in research and development, and that could actually eventually create high value jobs and the diversification of economies. And one area, for example, that we have not seen anything that coming out of Africa, and probably will take some time, is the whole area around manufacturing, whether it is for drugs or for vaccines, because one could argue that there are market failures that are failing the funding of tech innovations in Africa and low and middle income countries, including how manufacturing can be done cheaper, faster, and being done near the outbreak geographies, wherever it is happening. So maybe that could be a lesson to take forward.
That's great, thank you. So Kate Wood is asking, how may we as a world recover from the social recession caused as a side effect of the pandemic? It's one of those massive questions. David, I think you look as if you might like to answer that. I can see you smiling.
I'm smiling because I wish I knew the answer, and I think many politicians wish they knew the answer as well. I think it's a very real and significant challenge, and it has so many different aspects to that in terms of the social aspects of what the pandemic has done in the UK and around the world. I don't know the answer. I really don't know the answer, and I think controlling the pandemic is the first step. But there's no doubt at all that we are going to see the very long-lasting effects of this on, as Jeremy's talked about, health workers, on those that have lost loved ones, on those that have been hit economically and gone into poverty from this epidemic and pandemic, and that will be something that society is going to have to grapple with for some time. I don't think there's an easy answer.
Mm. We've got an interesting question from John Beck about global leadership. So during the 2008 financial crash, global leadership was apparent and an integrated approach was developed, particularly through involvement of the G20. Would the panel care to comment on any integrated global approach and global leadership in the current global crisis? What, if anything, could or should have been done differently at a global level? Tamar, would you like to?
Oh my gosh.
Think about that one.
Question.
Not.
I mean, again, I think this is the time. I mean, I feel like when else have we had so much of the world's population facing exactly the same health challenge at once? Obviously, the way that we're managing it in different countries has been varied, but this is, this is unique in that sense. And in that sense, it's a test for us for the equity questions and the questions around, how, as a human race, how we take the lessons from this and make sure that we don't see those the same big challenges repeated. We may see other ones, but we try and address the ones that we've had a chance to test out, because we haven't had this opportunity. And I think, the eyes of the world are on whether we can deal with this in an equitable way. In terms of global leadership, again, I think a lot of this is going to come in hindsight. I think it's a really good opportunity for us to look at some of the international laws and regulations and processes around dealing with a global pandemic. Were they fit for purpose? How should they be changed? What do we need to bring into practice to make decisions easier? What are those roles of the international national organizations at a time like this? Those boundaries are really interesting questions to ask ourselves. But as I said, a lot of this is going to come later. That's probably all I would say right now. I mean,
I'll be a little bit blunter, Sarah. There's
Pardon?
been an absolute catastrophic failure of global leadership. Let's be honest.
I was coming to you, yes.
Let's be honest.
Yeah.
The G20, this pandemic has happened at a time of very heightened political tensions between the US and China, but other countries as well. Brexit is part of that. There's been a retreat to nationalism in the last 5 or 6 years. And frankly, the G7 and G20 have been missing. The structures are there to do things. World Bank, IMF. We were at a period when interest rates are essentially negative and money could have been borrowed. And during 2020, at critical moments, nobody stepped up into that leadership role and said, we are facing an economic and social catastrophe here, and we can spend peanuts on making sure that we get vaccines, treatment, oxygen, PPE to the world. And we didn't do that. Yeah. And we delayed those decisions when the structures were there to deliver them, and there was not that leadership. And you can blame certain administrations in certain countries, but it has been a collective failure of leadership, which was not true during the great financial crisis, when actually the G20 did step up, as the questioner asked. And I think we may need new structures, we may need new systems, but you can have whatever systems in the world if you don't have that leadership.
We have just about got to finish here, but will it happen again? What happens next time round? Ever so in a word or two. I mean, do we learn from this basically on global leadership?
If that's to me, then we have to learn. I mean, you can look back in the last 100 years, there's been various crises, and you either come out in them and you repeat the mistakes. That happened a couple of times in the 20th century, or you learn the lessons and you reform and you make it better. And yeah, we have a choice as we come through this. Which will we do? We should surely learn the lessons from the 20th century when we repeated the mistakes a few times.
Okay, so David, because we're finishing right now, would you like to sort of just wrap up and just say, well, thanks to everybody, obviously, but maybe you want to have a parting shot?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd just like to thank all of you. We've had, I think, up to almost 200 people listening today. So thank you very much for making time to listen to this. As ever, thanks to the speakers. I think we've illustrated really the number of challenges that exist still in global health around COVID. And I think also the things we need to go and think about for the future. And each time one looks at this, that list almost gets longer. But I hope that everyone here today and those on the call will help with, I think, that Herculean task and look forward to talking to you about how LSGM can help you in the future. So thanks very much, Sarah, for doing this, and have a good evening, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.